The Biden White House is adrift, according to NBC News. No, we're not talking about flooding in Washington, D.C. because the Potomac overflowed. We're talking about real trouble coming out of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That's the topic of today's video. First, I want you to check out the link tree below. Please subscribe anywhere that's convenient for you, whether it's Getter, whether it's Truth Social, which is the new Trump-backed social media app. You could go on Gab. I'm on Gab. You can go on Minds, and you can also find my video hosting over on Odyssey, BitChute, and Rumble. And let's get into the topic. So, what is happening with the Biden White House? It seems like every day, it doesn't matter whether the news is good or bad. The news is always bad when it comes to President Biden. And I think that it's really an indicator of how grim the situation's become when even people like Jake Tapper are losing their patience with the White House. There was an interview recently with a major White House aide, one of his economic advisors, where he was taking the guy to task for the Biden administration being aware well ahead of time, of the baby food shortage that was going to happen, and doing nothing until it was already too late. And it didn't go very well. In fact, the interview ended because the guy's camera fell. I don't know whether it was CNN's fault. I don't know whether it was this guy. I think his name was Brian Dees, his fault. But that is the way that it seems to be going for the Biden administration, that nothing seems to be going right, not even interviews on TV, like the technical aspect of the interview. So why is this feeling starting to really permeate everywhere that you go regarding the Biden administration? Well, I would say that there is a certain truth to the adage that success begets success and failure begets failure, and really the Biden administration is the failure of all failures. And you can pick the topic, right? I would say that the greatest failures are debatable. My personal opinion is that his administration really lost legitimacy with the vaccine mandate. That was really where I think it started to show that he had completely lost his moorings, that they were doing things just for the sake of saying that they were doing something and forcing people to do things even though they knew that it would come with a lot of pain and resistance, and it wouldn't actually lead to public health. But the point was compliance. The point was that everybody would be on the same team with respect to the COVID vaccines. And when the Supreme Court came back in January, and you shouldn't cheerlead for the Supreme Court, but often you have to thank them for doing things that are necessary. They came back and said that the broader vaccine mandate on the public was unconstitutional, and essentially delivered one of the worst constitutional slaps back at the Biden administration. So since then, there have been and before that, there have been a number of catastrophic defeats for the Biden administration and for America, by the way. So those of you that are thinking that this is just partisan schadenfreude, unfortunately, I'm suffering through the same situation as anyone else who lives here. And those of us that are kind of sitting back and laughing at what's happening, I don't think that we're really laughing at our own situation. There's a lot of misfortune going around, and there's real suffering being caused by this administration. So what are the big failures that have led up to this point? Well, of course, the latest is inflation and the economy and the lagging prosperity that the Biden administration has continuously promised. Now, what they usually do in order to deflect from the criticism is to say, well, there's record job growth, there's a lot of new businesses opening, America is getting out of the pandemic, we've overcome that stage. In the meantime, though, they keep warning that the pandemic isn't over, and that you have to remain vigilant and that you should always, take precautions and everything. And that's not necessarily only the Biden administration's fault. I think that having a lot of these same people who are holdovers from the Trump administration and previous to that, like Dr. Fauci, like the other senior members of the NIH and the CDC, that certainly contributes to it. So it's not like I'm blaming him or the White House alone, but you have to understand that they're sending mixed messages. They're talking about all of this job creation while saying, well, we might have to shut down again because of a new strain of COVID or the monkeypox or whatever. So all this anxiety in the markets, all of this, division between the haves and the have-nots in America, who many of the have-nots were thinking, well, we get the Democrats back in the White House, they'll start thinking about us again. They'll start thinking about the poor. They'll start thinking about minorities. They'll start thinking about women and all that. That's the mindset of the liberal Democrat and the progressive. Well, it's been a huge disappointment for them. So that's another big L for the Biden administration. The student loan debt is not really being reduced to any sort of satisfaction for many of those people. And you're seeing a lot of this angst not being on the right, but being actually on the left. A lot of these progressives are saying that the leadership that Biden was promising is actually not only inadequate, but it's regressive. It's actually taking America backwards. So a good example of that has been the defeat of a couple Biden-backed incumbents in recent elections, and also Biden-backed candidates for open House seats. So the best example is Kurt Schrader, Democrat in Oregon, who got just completely bushwhacked by the progressive challenger, and he has recently conceded his defeat. And that's going to be a real problem for the Democrats, that one of the few people who Biden explicitly endorsed in a House congressional race, who is a long-standing incumbent, got just wrecked and destroyed by a person further to the left. You have in the Pittsburgh area, you have Sonny Lee winning the nomination. This against a not an incumbent and not a person who was explicitly endorsed by Biden, but a more moderate opponent. So you certainly have challenges to Biden from the left that are not conceding any ground, and they're actually taking ground. And in Texas, there were two seats, one of which was held by Henry Cuellar, where the centrist Democrats are really holding on by the skin of their teeth. The Cuellar election has not been officially ruled yet, whether it's been concluded, and neither has the other seat, which I believe is being contested by the centrist Ruben Ramirez. So these are guys that are more generally centrist, and in Cuellar's case, he might not be endorsed by Biden, but he certainly is endorsed by Pelosi. Cuellar is also the only pro-life Democrat left in the House. The rest of those pro-life Democrats have basically been made extinct. There were other previous ones like Dan Lipinski and Bart Stupak, who were from Midwestern traditional areas, many of them very Catholic, ethnic districts and whatever, and they've largely become swamped by progressives who are simply more politically active. In fact, I would propose that the voting public at large maybe didn't change that much, but there simply has been a rise in progressive activism, and those are the people who vote in the primary. So those are the challenges for Biden on the left that are plaguing his administration, because the more you have people who are loyal to his mellow style of democratic politics, who are just getting shoved aside, the weaker that he is, because his faction of the party is basically, it's eroding, it's falling apart. You have people who are in their 80s who are running it, such as Steny Hoyer and Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer, by the way, who's also really old. So they are representative of an older generation. Pelosi, by the way, had her husband pulled over for DUI this past week or weekend, I believe, in California. And so certainly all those people are suffering from really voter fatigue. They don't really trust them anymore. So that's one element. And we've already talked about the issues of the vaccine mandate. And I'll also add to that the eviction moratorium that the Biden administration extended and was slapped down by the Supreme Court. You have the upcoming Roe v. Wade overturning, which is very likely. The media is treating it as a foregone conclusion, which is interesting. If Roe v. Wade is overturned, that becomes a major setback for the Biden administration. Not necessarily one that they could have avoided, I'll grant, because they don't get elected to control the Supreme Court, but certainly one that they've overpromised on. They're always talking about how they're going to defend abortion rights and women's rights if they get into the White House. And at this point, it's not going to be easy to do, because Roe v. Wade will allow states to define their own abortion policy, and you will have many states like Texas and Oklahoma or Georgia, my state, Ohio, that have more restrictive abortion laws, and then you'll have other states that have very lax abortion laws or none at all. So that would include New York, that would include Virginia, for the time being Virginia, because who's to say that the state couldn't change its abortion laws in the next couple years. It's going to be a very interesting situation, but it's not a situation that bodes well for the Biden administration, because so much of their messaging depends on this convoluted idea of a women's rights struggle, right? So they all they want to talk about is how women's rights are threatened by revoking the right to an abortion. It's a very interesting way of thinking, and it's actually, in my opinion, women who think that way, I think that they're really selling themselves short. There's a lot of other avenues of women's life and women's potential for getting more of a strong place in society that are completely different from the abortion debate, right? So feminism has been distilled to the abortion debate in many cases, or having more female CEOs or scientists or things like that, and it's become kind of a joke, and that's why I think the feminist movement has devolved into really just a rage lobby. And then we get to the issue of gun violence, okay? This is a topic I've already talked about in the past couple videos. So since then, there's been a development. There was a shooting in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, I believe, where 4 people were killed, plus the gunman. And the gunman used an AR-15 and a handgun in order to murder a surgeon who he blamed for back pain that he was having, that the surgeon wouldn't alleviate. So all of the facts are a little fresh, and one of the facts that is probably going to affect how widely the story is carried is that the gunman was in fact a middle-aged black guy, and therefore they're not going to blame the attack on the killer's motive, which is obviously the real reason why this happened, but on the weapon. And the truth of the matter is, this type of senseless violence, what would have happened if he'd only had the handgun? He still could have probably accomplished what he was trying to do. And that's really a topic that we can explore, and we have explored regarding other shootings at a different time. But the Biden administration, they're set to deliver an address. He is set to deliver an address tonight. It might be before this article is published, but he might deliver this address in order to talk about executive actions and legislative proposals that he wants done in order to fight gun violence. But the reality is that I think Americans are going to be disappointed if they're Biden supporters by what he gets accomplished here. There really is a level of social disintegration that's happening right now that Biden can't get a handle on, partly because he's taken us too far. All of this domestic angst and unrest is something that he was supposed to relieve Americans from, because he said that unlike Donald Trump, he would be a uniter and not a divider. Well, the truth of the matter is that after more than a year in power, he's not united anyone, and there's probably been more people who are united against him than are on his side. So it's going to be a real difficult proposition for him to get any significant initiative through. He might try an executive action as other presidents have tried in the past, and that will be a difficult thing to do constitutionally to make any difference in terms of the availability of firearms. Then lastly, so there's, or I don't know if it's going to be lastly, but the foreign policy theater. Joe Biden has been a total failure in foreign policy, and I do mean total. It doesn't just end with the failed withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was just a textbook example of mismanagement and carelessness. If not, if it was not carelessness, it had to be intentional malice of intent, because it was basically creating the worst result possible, and we don't know what the ramifications are going to be from the Afghan war until, we might never know exactly how long we're going to be feeling the ramifications of it. We were there for a very long time. It was correct for us to leave. And there was a way to leave, and Biden basically made it as painful as possible through his mismanaged withdrawal. Now that's already been talked about, so let's put Afghanistan to the side. He's angered the French by poaching a defense contract with Australia for submarines that the French had, and the Australians instead have reneged on that deal and bought submarines from the United States. So that's one problem. He's pissed off the British by getting involved needlessly in their dispute over Northern Ireland and its status within the European Union. He's also angered some people in Israel over the administration's pursuit of a new nuclear deal with Iran. So those are all key allies that the administration has ruffled feathers with. Apparently, he's also angered Mexico. Mexico is threatening not to come, I think it's next week. There's supposed to be a summit in Los Angeles next week that will be attended by all of the leaders of the Latin American heads of state are supposed to come there. Well, Biden has excluded some of the heads of state from some of the more radical left countries, such as Venezuela and Nicaragua, and as well as Cuba, and Mexico is threatening not to come. I don't know what the best choice would be there. I think maybe if, my personal opinion is don't hold the summit in the U.S., hold it somewhere else, and allow whoever wants to come to arrive. And diplomacy is an ugly business. Obviously, I'm not condoning the regimes of those countries, because I've talked about them extensively in the past, but having this condition which will preclude Mexico from coming is a major problem, in my opinion. So those are actually the minor failures of the Biden administration, except for obviously Afghanistan. And when I say minor, I would say that they have major implications, but they are not as bad as his mismanagement of Ukraine. The Biden administration has dumped all this money on Ukraine. People are seeing the headlines of billions of dollars being sent over there in the form of military equipment, of civilian relief, of cash. There's no accountability for it. The administration and Congress have refused to give any accountability for it by appointing an inspector general. And that includes, by the way, the majority of Republican senators and congressmen. They refuse to put any strings attached to the aid. They just shove it out the door like it's burning, and it's about to engulf their entire living room in flames while they're playing Xbox. That's the attitude of the Biden administration. Just throw money at the problem. What's happened in Ukraine is that the media has created a narrative of the conflict that is saying one thing, and then reality on the ground says something else. If you watch the media, even conservative media, by the way, and even most of the left-wing media, as is expected nowadays, but there are exceptions, they seem to be eager to highlight every single episode where the Ukrainians are smoking the Russians and winning some spectacular victory. And I get it, because Ukraine needs all the help it can get, because they're at a disadvantage. They're the aggressed country. They were attacked unprovoked. People will say that they provoked Russia. I don't really accept the explanation. The Russian grievances against Ukraine could have been solved without a full-scale invasion, and yet Russia invaded and has just brutalized Ukraine. So I'm not going to accept the idea that this is an unjust war on the part of Ukraine. Ukraine needs to defend itself, and they have every right to. But beyond that, what's really defined the war is this propaganda effort on the part of Western nations and their media and the Ukrainian government to make it seem as if Ukraine is doing well in the war, when in reality, it's been a very mixed situation. Early on, obviously, the Russians had a number of big gains and then major setbacks, and even embarrassing defeats, such as the sinking of the Moskva battleship. So let's not ignore several impressive victories on the part of the Ukrainians. But the problem is that the war continues now, and notwithstanding all of the setbacks and all of the obstacles that they've had to encounter, Russia is now seriously degrading Ukraine's ability to defend itself. The eastern part of the country, known as the Donbass, is slowly but with increasing speed falling under control of the Russians. The city of Sieverodonetsk, I think that's how you pronounce it, is basically being swallowed up by the Russians, and that would be the end of the Ukrainian defense of the Luhansk province, oblast as they call it in Russian and Ukrainian. So Russia has accomplished a number of its strategic objectives. They have basically cut off Ukraine from the sea. The Ukrainians still have a little bit of coastline that they control, but they can't access it by ship because the Russians have it blockaded. The Azov Sea is controlled by the Russians. The Azov Battalion, or regiment, which was the most talked about unit in the war, has been defeated and has surrendered. Their commander is a POW. That's a valuable bargaining chip for the Russians. A lot of the Ukrainian air capability has been degraded, and it's not easy to replace. And by the way, so you can replace the planes, how do you replace the pilots? That's a question that's not easy to answer. Do you have to bring in pilots from abroad? They've been bringing in volunteers from foreign countries. I believe there's probably, there's probably efforts to get Poland to send troops that will basically serve as Ukrainian troops. It's become a very volatile situation over there, and in my reading, the Ukrainians are going to suffer a pretty catastrophic defeat pretty soon. Now, what could that mean? It could mean that the Russians simply encircle a major group of Ukrainian forces and cut them off and force them to surrender. That would create a situation where basically the front has moved significantly to the west, and the Russians are in danger of overwhelming the Ukrainian lines and really, changing the face of the war. Okay, now I'll also concede that in the past I've predicted that Russia is going to succeed at certain things, and it hasn't happened. So, it's not easy to predict how a war is going. You're not there. I think that it is also foolish to just share footage that is raw, that you haven't confirmed came from the war. That's really what happened. If you remember, there was this, I think the guy's name was General Barry Michaels or something, this U.S. 4-star general that shared war footage of Ukraine shooting down a Russian fighter plane that turned out to be from a video game. So I don't think that you have to rely on me as the authority for what's going on in Ukraine, but it is going poorly for the Ukrainians, and they have not been able to push the Russians out. In fact, they're losing gradually more territory, and once the situation becomes so bad that the Ukrainian leadership, besides Zelensky, starts to see that he's painted them into a corner, I do think that we're going to see him removed from power. And I've been pretty harsh on Zelensky, but I'll tell you what is keeping him in power? It's the ability of him and his aides to get before the media and represent Ukraine's cause as being heroic and being, this real underdog against Russian aggression. But that has its limits, right? People, they may sympathize with Ukraine, but in reality, they don't want to do much about it because, after all, talk is cheap, and doing something actually may risk their own life and limb or their pocketbook. So many of these people are very shallow, and the Zelensky mystique will probably wear off. And it's probably already worn off for some of the people who are in the Ukrainian senior leadership. And if the war gets to such a stage that the Ukrainians are basically in full retreat, who do you think is going to be blamed for it? By people including President Biden, who is the actual topic of this video, Vladimir Zelensky. So that's actually what Biden did. He blamed the president of Afghanistan for the fall of Afghanistan. Not to say that the guy was blameless, but the United States is so involved in Afghanistan. Yeah, we had a hand in how that disaster happened, and we have had a very involved part in the Ukraine conflict. And if that turns out to be a disaster, like what happened in Afghanistan, we're going to have responsibility over that too. But the President Biden, if you look at the way that he reacts to situations like this, where things don't go well, he doesn't know how to actually take responsibility. He's good at deflecting it. In fact, today was it yesterday? He basically said that his White House was aware of the problem with the baby formula, the shortages, but he was not. So this is a guy who knows how to deflect blame. Another thing that he did, this made the papers this weekend. Okay, so I am predicting he is going to blame Zelensky if the war starts to really turn sour, as it looks like it could happen. But another thing that he did this weekend, which it shows really the character of the guy, is there were reports that he got mad that his communications department seems to find ways of walking back his statements. So whenever he says something that is idiotic, like that, he goes to he's been on Amtrak so many times that he has this record of some sorts, that there's this Amtrak conductor who used to tell him, you've been all these miles or whatever. There's this long story that he goes through. He talks about it all the time. That is a false story. And he complains now that even though he made up this story and it's not true and it's just a bunch of bunk and nobody's actually interested in it, he's mad that things like that get walked back by his aides. He's mad that they walked back statements like what he said about the U.S. being willing to defend Taiwan with force. He's walked back statements. He's mad that they've walked back statements about all sorts of things. About, I mean, I'm sure that they're going to have to walk back what he said about 9mm ammunition. They had to walk back his statement about how Putin could not remain in power. So all of those issues that he creates because he doesn't know how to control what he says. He doesn't know how to speak articulately, and when he does speak, he ends up saying something that is ridiculous. He gets mad when other people try to clean up his messes. This weekend, he also this is just over and over again. He comes out with more things of the same style. He claimed that there was a senator from Delaware, where he's from, the senator who was before him, who appointed him to the Naval Academy, but he never took the appointment because he wanted to play football. Even the mainstream media has come forward and said, yeah, it's not really at all possible that this happened, because Biden, at the time that this story was supposed to have occurred, 1965, was already graduating from the University of Delaware. And if you don't know, in order to get into any of the 3 armed forces military academies, you have to be before college. So these are all episodes that show that this guy is simply unfit to lead. And some people will write it off as just him being himself, and it's just the old folksy grandpa and all of that. You can't really continue with that forever, and especially now that this is an issue that I haven't really talked about personally, because I read about it, but I sometimes feel like most people will not pay attention. The Hunter Biden laptop story has officially exploded into the media, not because of the illegal and corrupt practices of the Biden family that were exposed by Miranda Devine and by other reporters who were a part of that. The reason that it's exploded is because of the racy porn videos that Biden's son Hunter was creating and sharing, and even sharing with his dad. So people are I think, waking up to the fact that, yeah, he seems to like to portray himself to the world as this very nice, stately, elderly man who has like a finer appreciation for life, and that's the image that he likes to project. But in reality, he is just as corrupt as his critics portray him, right? And possibly worse. This is a guy who allowed his son to be so close to the trough, and even put his son in those situations, knowing his son's weaknesses, simply because he was greedy and was looking for a way to use his office for his own personal enrichment and that of his family members. So that would be him, his son, his brother, James Biden. Those are all elements that are really spilling over into the media, but really because of Hunter Biden's depraved sexual life. So people can talk all the time about how Biden has this second wind coming, and things have been worse before, and Obama was in a tough situation after his first midterm, and Clinton was in a tough situation, and Trump. But I don't think it's the same situation. I think that when NBC News is saying that Biden is adrift, they're trying to say that they think that he's sunk. He cannot seem to bail out any water, and he just keeps taking more on. So that's about it for right now. Please like, share, and subscribe. You can also find me on all of the links below, whether it is Getter, Minds, Substack. I'm also on Truth Social, Gab, Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, and anything else you can find down there at the link tree. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you later.